And we're on Mr. Grant Hayman, all the way from Edmonton in Alberta, Canada. How are you, sir?
I'm doing excellent, and I'm glad to be with you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Now, I know I don't have you for long, so I'll launch straight into it. I've been researching your amazing website this week, ovaltech.ca. I'd recommend that to anyone who's interested in, how would you say it, like potential alternative space travel technologies, I guess. Alternative to NASA's conventional rocket propulsion. Would that be about right?
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
Yeah. And what I really like on your site is you're not just putting forward various hypotheses and that's it, but you're linking to all the latest scientific experiments, in universities and so on, where we can see, well, hang on, there can be something here with each one of these alternatives to rocket propulsion. And this is all ovaltech.ca is all through your company, Ovaltech Advanced Interstellar Space Propulsion Systems. So I guess unpacking all that, I guess to begin, Grant, can you let me know what's your background and how did you get into this field of interstellar research?
Sure, I can definitely explain where Ovaltech came from. So I grew up with Star Wars, so that's kind of my original interest. I was always fascinated with space. I wanted to be an astronaut.
Okay.
But, quite early, I realized that the space program was very small and specialized. Pretty much, the space program is nearly non-existent in Canada at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I was fascinated with the idea enough to start looking alternatives. I figured, well, it was kind of maybe a bold idea, but I figured if I couldn't get on with NASA, I would just do it my own way.
Right.
So I always had a fascination with physics and stuff like that, and started researching, the physics of these alternative methods. Like maybe rockets weren't the way to do it. I had heard things about UFOs and flying saucers and stuff like that, and I figured, well, I don't know anything about that, but if these things are real, how would they do it? And I think there's some discussion about if a certain technology is already possible, it makes it more likely that you will be able to rediscover it or discover it yourself.
Okay. Right.
And so in that research, I actually found enough information that I felt I had to share it with people. And so my website was born one day out of that need to reach out to people and see if these kind of ideas had merit, and to kind of inspire people to keep working on these concepts that I've discovered and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I would say, sorry, that my it's not really my work. I kind of more put together a bunch of information, like compiled it, more so than I ever really came up with anything unique on my own. So maybe what's different about my website is I'm not touting my solution to the problem per se, but showing people that there is a lot more out there than they might know of.
definitely. And I think I can see on there you're attracting a lot of scientists too, and you've linked to their pages. You're showing their articles, so it's not, as you say, it's not you saying you have the golden solution, but I think it's when you take all the evidence together. And I've spent about off and on. I've spent the last week just reading different articles, then thinking about that, researching outside your site, and it it's, yeah, as I say, it's compelling, and it just feels like we should be researching this on a greater level, and there should be discussion. So it's great we're able to do that today. Now, when you mentioned there that Canada, growing up, you wanted to be an astronaut, and then you realized gradually that Canada's budget for that, or their space department, was very small. you know, you could even say, since we landed on the moon, you could say, well, NASA's budget has been relatively small. I mean, the thing that I keep thinking about is, how were we able to do the, you know, we did the Apollo moon missions 1969 to 1972. You know, I don't know how many, I think there was about a dozen missions there, okay? Now, so that's 45 years since we set foot on the moon. Now, you know, for the people who were around alive during that period, how would they have ever thought, you know, it was possible that we would have achieved so little since? I mean, I know you can argue, well, we're sending probes to the end of the solar system and all that sort of stuff, but in terms of men and space, it's why the stagnation in space exploration since then?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had to think about that a little bit, and I think what really happened is the Apollo missions, like, we consider it kind of a scientific mission
Hmm.
and an exploration mission, but I think the real purpose of those Apollo missions is it was a military race, and essentially when they achieved that race and won it, they were successful. The race was over. And so there's even people that have worked in NASA, and they said once the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s, and that a lot of congressmen came to NASA and said, well, you know, the competition with Russia is over. We don't need a space program anymore. And so it's that kind of thinking from the politicians,
Okay.
and they're the ones that are basically assigning the money that really, you know, put a huge damper on space exploration.
Hmm.
I think another huge factor that'll likely tie into some of the other subjects that we're going to discuss is that there is a real lack of social interest in that. There is quite a few people that are of the opinion that, you know, food, survival, environmental issues, you know, the standard of living for people in general in some parts of the world should be much higher priorities than exploring space.
Yeah,
And I would
I
agree
can
that,
see merit in that thinking. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So I think that the main reasons that our space exploration is maybe not as advanced as much as people would like is for the money, social and political reasons.
Okay. So, but reading your site, I was wondering if it also ties into the limitations of rocket propulsion. Like, can we go beyond? Can we send men to the end of the solar system even with rocket technology? Or
Yeah, like I may be stepping a little bit ahead of myself here,
yeah.
but I wrote down a quick point here, and I think in terms of the government, it's hard to spend money feeding a horse in the barn when you have a sports car in the garage. So I think that there may be, you know, some alternatives, and the public side of the space program is maybe not the only side of the space program.
Okay. All right. We'll get to that. I know where you're heading, but we'll get to that. So let's go back a bit. So we're 2017 now. Now in the early, I think the late 19th century, early 20th, we had the great Nikola Tesla, and in a place called Wardenclyffe in New York, he was doing some wild experiments, wasn't he? Now you were telling me, you mentioned to me off the air about his world wireless system and how that technology he was experimenting with may relate to your research and concepts, or the concepts that, sorry, not yours, but the concepts that you're reporting on your site. So what I want to know is, if Tesla's technology had not been blocked or suppressed a century ago, how would that technology of Tesla's have benefited humanity over the last century or so?
So yeah, I want to discuss Tesla's Wardenclyffe, and I could go on at tremendous length on this subject. So I'm going to try and cover this as quickly as possible. So basically, when Tesla was developing the society, it was like early 1900s, the late 1800s. We didn't really have electricity like we do today. So they were developing DC power, and Tesla came along and came up with this concept of AC power. And the big advantage of that was it allowed a much more efficient distribution. And
Hmm.
so basically, it allowed us to generate at a fixed location and transmit that to users, much further away than they could with DC. And it also allowed the creation of more efficient motors and more efficient generators. And this was a foundation of basically our electrical distribution system that we still use today. And we could argue that this distribution system of power that we have is a fundamental reason our civilization has become as advanced as it has.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah.
if it wasn't for this, we would still be burning oil lamps and candles and stuff like that,
Hmm.
heating our homes. So it's important to understand how much what we have now, based on Tesla's technology, has defined our civilization and our society. And now you've likely heard they talk a bit about a war of occurrence and how the companies had originally invested in DC, and Tesla came along and demonstrated this alternating current system, and they were slow to adopt, and there was some arguments and a bit of hesitation, and unlikely this won out, and they estimate Tesla would have made trillions in royalties if he'd been involved a little bit more.
Yeah, he wasn't a sharp businessman, was he? He was just a scientist.
No,
Yeah.
no, that's usually the case with scientists. Like maybe I'm not much of a salesman myself, actually.
Yeah.
But the thing is that most people don't realize he actually came up with a third system, and that's what we know today as his world wireless system. Um, I point out the biggest misconception about Tesla's world wireless system is it uses some sort of radio technology to transmit power. And that is where most people are wrong about what Tesla was suggesting. So today you'll find like actually our power system relies heavily on the ground. So we transmit power with the wires. We have radio transmitting through the air, but we use the ground as a return path.
Sure.
So Tesla's world wireless system is not really radio. He was talking about wireless in terms of not using wires for the transmission. His
Hmm.
concept was to actually use the world as the wire. The Earth is similar actually to a metal sphere, and being that it's conducting in a big giant sphere, if you pump power into it at any point, if done properly, you can access that power anywhere in the world. And this was the fundamental concept that Tesla's World Wireless was based on. Um, if you look at a radio tower, it's actually kind of a sharp point. And
Yes.
if you've ever seen pictures of Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, it's actually quite round,
It's
almost.
a it's a round dome, isn't it? It's not pointed
Yeah,
at
it's
all.
a
Yeah.
big ball on the top. And the
Mm.
reason for that, he was not designing it to transmit power out into the air. In Tesla's system, the ground is actually the source of the power, and the radio waves or the air is the return path. So it's actually completely opposite to the system that we have in use today.
Wow.
Now, in terms of how this would have benefited the world, basically what you would have had is a device similar to a radio, albeit much larger and designed to handle more current, that you would have in your house or outside in your backyard, and that would be your source of power. And the thing to realize is you could put that anywhere on the earth. So we could have electrified the middle of the desert, the middle of the Arctic, Antarctica, out in the jungle.
Mm-hmm.
So you realize that this opens up a tremendous amount of freedom and advantages to a civilization that you
So,
have this.
so just to take an example, Grant, if let's say we were going to deliver, let's say this technology was taken further. If I delivered one of these devices to a village in Africa with nothing else, they could then have essentially free energy.
It would be free in the sense that they would have energy at that location where
Right.
they are. Like, I mean, it wouldn't be free in the sense they would have to pay for it. They would have to have this source, this radio receiver type device.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it would still cost to build the transmission towers to
Sure.
produce it.
Yeah.
And the transmission towers themselves would require a source of energy. Tesla proposed hydro and that sort of thing.
Okay.
But it would be free in the sense that, yeah, you could supply them with this device and they would have power. You wouldn't have to build a tower where there was no access to hydro or resources in order to generate that electricity.
So we wouldn't be using all the resources we are now, the natural resources of the earth.
Well, originally, yes. Like Tesla's Watered Cliff Tower was designed to be run off hydro or coal or however they're generating power at the time.
Okay.
It does lead into this concept of free energy, but I am really careful when I bring up the subject as free energy because you can't get energy from nothing.
That's a good point.
This is
Yeah.
well proven in physics.
Mm-hmm.
So what Tesla was proposing and what he actually discovered is when he was experimenting with his tower and pumping energy into the ground and recovering it at some distance away, he discovered that there was already natural power there due to the environment of the earth. And you can think of it as an energy gradient between space that is very, very cold and the earth or the ground, which is actually really hot. Whenever you have some sort of polarity in energy like that, there's always the potential to generate energy from that. And so
Right.
he wasn't really generating energy for free from nothing. He was tapping energy from the environment.
Okay.
Tesla liked to describe it as if you had a thermocouple or a thermopile, which is two dissimilar metals that one end of which is cold and the other end you heat up, and even a flame of a candle or something like that. And you can generate electricity that way. And he said if you, in theory, had a giant thermopile with one end reaching out into space and one end on the surface of the earth, you could generate power that way. So it's just a different source of electrical energy where he's tapped into the environment and the functioning of the earth itself.
And we wouldn't have, if that had been able to be taken further, potentially we wouldn't have had the same pollution that we've had.
No, there would be means to reduce the pollution.
Right. Okay.
For sure, it would be less. Part of the problem we have right now is we don't really consider the amount of energy that we use. So these sources would maybe require, fine tuning our use of energy and that. But likely we have moved away from coal and these sorts of things. I also like to describe it as tapping into the wheelworks of nature.
Right. Right. Mm. So how do you feel the world wireless system relates to the research that you're doing on space travel and so on?
So you can see how technology leads to what would I say, a social or a civilization, a social structure, or a more advanced civilization. And Tesla talked about this at length about increasing human energy. How if we had this potential energy behind us and the means, you know, to live without fear of where our next meal was coming from and not focusing so much on survival,
Right.
it gives civilization the opportunity to advance in new directions.
Mm.
Almost to the extent that when our, you know, forefathers learned to cultivate and moved away from a nomadic lifestyle, is when villages first formed, and you started to get basically the very beginnings of civilization itself, when communities were formed and things like that.
That's true. So that almost goes back to what we were talking about before about politicians now just don't feel it's a priority to invest in space travel.
For sure. And
Mm.
a lot of the reasons for political division and the current social structure we now is based upon scarcity of resources and
Yeah. Yeah.
the scarcity of energy, and these divisions, political divisions, arise because of that. This person has all the oil. This person has some rare minerals and diamonds or gold and that sort of thing, and
Yeah.
that leads to these divisions.
Mm.
When you break down those divisions with some sort of readily available energy that anybody can tap into and stuff like that, you start to break down those political barriers and those social barriers that hold us back,
Right.
as much as it did with the cavemen moving from a nomadic lifestyle to a more agrarian lifestyle.
Yeah. I mean, what you were talking about before about how most humans on the planet now are still worried about survival, where they're getting the next meal. We haven't progressed that much on those sort of levels, but I also think it ties into nations have a fear of running out of oil, and that leads to all these divisions too. So it's kind of an individual thing, and then this large sectors of society or nations or like the entire EU needs a certain amount of energy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And so to tie this in with advanced propulsion and how I guess I came at it from the other direction, I was interested in advanced propulsion
Yes.
and realized that when you start to understand how the wheel works of nature, as Tesla say, how that works and what powers our own planet and powers our sun and how things are all connected, you start to realize that knowing these forces that bring light and heat to the earth and the force which moves planets in their orbits about the sun, these are the same forces upon which ships of the future will sail.
Yes.
Everything is connected, right?
Yep.
Harnessing that natural energy for a civilization leads to a greater understanding of how we're connected to that.
Right. And so does Tesla's is anything about in Tesla's work, does anything relate to, did he ever write about, or did he ever have any patents or whatever that talked about space travel at all? Or it's more that, is it more a case that modern researchers in alternative space methods just use Tesla as a launching board, and that it's more that he was talking about energy for the Earth, but some people are thinking that same energy could be used for space travel. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So when Tesla realized that there was these quite powerful fields around the Earth and energy existed around the Earth, he realized methods that he could tap into them. And he had developed what he called airplanes without wings, basically. And these were a completely different technology where he had basically they were long cigar shaped vessels
Mm.
with um, I would call them electrical condensers, I guess, on either end, and they were electrical field devices where he would actually use Wardenclyffe to transmit energy to these aerial vehicles so that
That's
he could
amazing.
fly them around the world. Or
Wow. That's incredible. I remember actually after I asked that question, I remember it came into my mind that I've seen those diagrams of those bizarre shaped airplanes or whatever they were that he was looking to invent. How far did you know if he ever flew any of those, or were they just
I've
theories?
read rumors that he had some apparatus that he would fly around his field wearing his top hat and his suit, and that some farmers had seen him like levitating platform type devices and things like this. But
Okay.
how far he actually progressed, I think maybe some of that is some of the stuff that's been quite suppressed, or was maybe something that they weren't so keen to release to the public.
Okay. And it could even be that, I mean, beyond the conspiracy theories about Tesla, sometimes it could just be that humanity's just not ready to conceive of certain ideas and he's too far ahead of his time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And then this plays back into the whole social understanding. Like, even back, you were talking about, the reasons we never went back to the moon. Well, I mean, on the sixth moon landing, already by that time, people were bored with it and changing the channel. They'd rather watch I don't know what the television shows were at the time, but I mean, it took very little time for people to just no longer be concerned and stuff like that, right? So
Yeah. So, moving on from Tesla, getting back to what I've just been reading on your website and so on. When it comes to, space travel, I'm curious as to what alternatives to rocket propulsion systems there may be. Now, to my mind, and what I've researched before separately, I always think of anti-gravity technology, whether that's wherever that comes from. That's my first instinct. But then, as I was reading on your site, I came across magnetic resonance. And you showed there the various it kind of blew my mind, these various lab experiments to show that magnetic resonance can not only make something invisible, but can make it completely vanish from our dimension and then reappear. Is that right?
sure. So we're getting into some pretty technical stuff. So
Okay.
I'll try to cover
Yeah.
this as quickly as possible in as simple terms as possible.
Thank you.
So when people think about anti-gravity technology and alternatives to rocket propulsion, one of the things that always comes up is the Star Wars type Star Trek propulsion, where they go faster than the speed of light.
Yes.
So there's, pardon me, there's numerous people on the internet with their theories as to how faster than light travel works and so on and so forth. But what this is it's actually a huge misunderstanding about what the speed of light limitation actually is in our universe, and how that controls these concepts of speed and travel. I like to explain it that breaking the speed of light is logically similar to the concept of going slower than stopped. Like, if you're stopped, you can't go any slower. And if you're at the speed of light, you basically can't go any faster. It is just an impossible concept without meaning. So, unlike the concept of like breaking the sound barrier, where they just had to push harder and harder and faster,
Sure.
there isn't really a method to break the speed of light in that manner, because it just goes against the laws of nature.
Okay.
You can think of the speed of light like the speed that time flows. You can think of two cars traveling down the highway at exactly the same speed. If you're going the same speed as all the other cars or another car on the highway, all those vehicles appear stopped. relative to you.
Actually, that's true, isn't it? Yeah.
So when you reach the speed of light, you're actually going as fast as you can possibly go. You're going at the rate that time flows. And to reach the speed of light is actually identical to stopping the flow of time, which means it's stopped. So the flow of time and the speed of light are actually kind of this, I don't know what, for lack of a better term, a circle.
Okay.
There isn't really a way to go outside that circle
Mm.
in terms of a brute force linear acceleration. So the alternative solution actually relies on this deeper understanding of an interconnection between all things. So to talk about how you can vanish from our dimension,
Mm.
as you were bringing up, you think of a concept of a box of marbles. That's, you have a box, you packed it completely full of marbles.
Okay.
Can't get a single other marble in there. There's just no room in. What this is it actually represents the reality of our universe. There is this underlying connection between all things, whereas we see empty space, and yet there is still something there. If it was completely empty, it couldn't exist in our universe. There's this structure underlying everything, like this box of marbles where everything is completely interconnected.
Right.
When you have a box of marbles like that, you can think of this new type of travel as like cutting a hole in the box in one side and cutting another hole on the other side. Now, if you push a new marble into the box, there's no room in there, so a marble has to come out the hole on the other side. The speed at which you push a marble in one hole is the speed at which the marble comes out the other hole.
Wow.
This is independent of how big the box is, how many marbles are in it, or anything like that. You could have a box of marbles a mile across. You push one on one side, it has to come out the other side. It's pretty much an instantaneous type of reaction.
So then you're talking, if that can be replicated on a bigger scale, like let's say you're in Edmonton now, I'm in Sydney. We cut that analogy you gave there. So instead of cutting the hole in the box, we somehow cut the distance between us. If that can be replicated with human beings, so then we can, or flying crafts, then you're really talking teleportation.
Yeah, we don't really have the terminology for it.
Okay.
There's some terms like warp travel, teleportation. Teleportation tends to refer to like taking apart the matter, putting it into a stream, and then beaming it somewhere, and then putting it all back together again. Where in this case, you're not really destroying or altering the information. You're just sending the information in one shot from one place to another. It's like two places existing at the same time. If you think about the analogy, though, the argument is that, well, the marble that you're pushing into the box isn't this marble that comes out on the other side.
Okay.
So the argument against this type of transportation, we'll say, becomes more an issue of identity.
Right. Right.
And information definition. If that underlying framework of the universe is uniform and identical and all in contact, then in theory it's more the way that you push the marble in that defines the way that it comes out on the other side, not necessarily the composition of the marbles themselves.
Right. Well, one thing, you said just before that we don't really have terminologies for these things because it's so new in quantum physics or whatever physics we're talking about here. But I quite like I wrote this down, what you wrote on the website, that it's traveling without moving or non-linear propulsion. So non-linear as in, I guess, it's not you go straight from A to Z. You don't go A, B, C. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, so the difference between like linear propulsion and me, and I'm likely bending the physics terminology a bit here,
Sure.
is that when you measure speed in any normal sense, speed is the distance over time. So you watch something and it starts at point A, and you start your stopwatch and it travels over a certain distance and it gets to point B, and you stop your stopwatch and you say, okay, it traveled this distance and it took it this long to do it. That is our entire concept of speed.
Right.
When you start talking about this concept of instantaneous transport, you can measure that in terms of speed, but the concept of speed just, it doesn't really apply to that situation. You can force it to apply, and you can say, okay, your box is you know such and such long from one hole to the other, and you start the stopwatch when you push the marble in, and you stop the stopwatch when it comes out. But it's
Sure.
basically, it's coming out at the same time that you're pushing it in on the other side. So there isn't really any definition for you to start and stop the stopwatch.
Wow.
It basically, the concept of speed just doesn't apply to it. So this relates back to, we were talking about Tesla's aerial machine.
Yes.
And again, we're running into these concepts of, we're calling it an aeroplane or an aerial device.
Yeah, I was wondering what to call it, because I could
Yeah,
I could remember those images, and I was thinking, what the hell can I call that?
yeah, and that's exactly it. Is the problem is it's not using the air to fly, and our entire aviation system, aerospace, is based upon air. Even our rockets are actually limited to the air friction and stuff like that until they get quite high up above the atmosphere. So these concepts of airplane and aerospace and speed, they kind of have to fall by the wayside when we step into these new fields of advanced propulsion. They just no longer really apply.
Right, and I want to get across to listeners that the thing I picked up here, the magnetic resonance, is really just one or two articles on your site, and you're mentioning a lot of different ways that there can be alternatives to rocket propulsion systems. That was just the one that I really hooked on and thought, wow, that's incredible. But there are, you've got a lot of different ones now. If you and I are able to talk about this, and you've known this for quite some time, then I think the obvious question is, well, surely the military are aware of these sort of things. You've got private contractors like Lockheed Martin and so on. So in the top secret or classified sector, what do you believe some of these things are already being either experimented with? Are they the reasons that people see strange crafts in the sky? Is this the reason why not much budget has gone to NASA? Those sort of things. What's your thoughts on the various wild conspiracy theories you hear on these things?
I absolutely believe that there is secret research going on into these fields. Like I said, I'm not a genius. I'm not claiming to have solved the advanced space propulsion problems. All I've done is gone out and read a lot of information, tried to find a correlation between it. Picked out the parts that connected, made the connections is what I've done. If I can make the connections, people far more intelligent than me can make the connections. And in that sense, not even maybe intelligence on our Earth, but intelligence elsewhere, because if we could figure it out, I don't see any reason why any other intelligence could figure it out.
Actually, that's a good
So
point. That's a good point. So the question is not just whether it's military intelligence agencies, private contractors, but also if we're not alone in the universe, then others have figured it out too.
absolutely. In my physics, I took some astronomy courses, and I was absolutely astounded at the size of the universe. Anybody who doesn't really fathom the ideas of other intelligence and stuff like that in the universe just doesn't really comprehend the scale of things. Even what's another thing that's kind of not commonly known is when the scientists or astronomers are discussing the scale of our universe and its size and its age, they're discussing the visible size of the universe. Light from the farthest reaches of the universe takes time to reach us.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look further back in space, we're actually looking further back in time. And so they can look far, far away and see these ancient objects, and they say, like, okay, this light took 16 billion years to reach us. We're looking at some of the very first structures in the universe. So they're like, well, the universe is 16 billion years old. This is how big it is. But you have to realize, so that light from 16 billion years ago took 16 billion years to reach us. What has happened out there in 16 billion years? We don't know. We have no idea.
So it could have grown. You're saying it could have grown a lot more.
Oh, for sure. It's been growing for 16 billion years. And so when you look off into space, even if you're looking at light that's taken a year to reach us, we don't actually know what's going on out there right now. Everything that we see when we look out into space is actually old news.
So even to take a small example, I was out last night, looked out and saw the moon. Now the light that travels from there, I'm not exactly seeing the moon in the moment, am I?
No, there is a slight delay. It's about 8 minutes from the sun. I'm not sure what it is from the noon. It's quite brief. I think it's a few seconds or something like that. I'm sure someone could correct me on that. But yeah, there is this delay, and so Einstein investigated this at quite length, and this is where he kind of began the formulations of his theories about the speed of light and that sort of thing, that there's much more to the universe than just this visible speed of light. The light and visible light is just one small part of what's actually going on out there.
So to take your, you're based in Canada. I was thinking, I recently read that the highest ranking politician to speak out was that guy Paul Hellyer. I think that's his name. He's formerly Canadian. Is it? Was it military? What was his rank? Do you remember that in Canadian politics?
I believe he was involved in defense in Canada at one point in time. I do know the name.
Yeah. So he's spoken out a lot about some type of secret space program and even contacts between. He believes that he got word through the Canadian end that the US has been involved with other civilizations and been given technologies and all that. So how do you? And of course, once again, we're not idiots. When you hear one person, it could be disinformation. It could be, you don't take that as gospel. But there have been quite a few high-ranking people like that come out. So, how do you, from the research you've done, which is much more, I must let listeners know that your side is all factual. It doesn't get into that stuff. But I'm just interested, how do you, when you hear all those things like Area 51, Roswell, all those things, what's your, and then the millions of sightings of these craft around the world, where do you believe it's coming from? If they're real, those sightings.
So when I started investigating, these concept of advanced space propulsion, I was a
Hmm.
very scientific physics bent. So I was looking at the math and looking at the science and stuff like that. When you research it from that point of view, and this has actually happened to quite a few very prominent scientists, and people are not aware of this, but what you eventually find is that you kind of hit a wall where you find that the mathematics and the physics and the science starts to fail at providing the full explanation. And so, likely, the greatest realization that I've had is that intelligence and life, and I would even say spirituality, plays a far greater role in the universe than people would possibly accept right now in our society. Like, I've heard, there's kind of this um, disagreements between the importance of religion and science, and I'm careful to touch on this subject. But
Right.
in discussing these technologies, and our future and stuff like that, it's my firm belief that we cannot exclude life, intelligence, and spirituality from our science. And in the
Right.
future, we are going to develop a science of spirit where we
Okay.
find that these two concepts that we call science and religion cannot be so easily separated like we have done in our society today.
And
And
that's quite recent.
realize,
That's quite recent too, isn't it, Grant? That the separation between, that we're told they're totally mutually exclusive. Say spiritual concepts, paranormal, whatever, and then science is that there can be no crossover. And if you brought up your last, the last 2 minutes of what you said in a university, well, you'd potentially be escorted off campus, or at least laughed at.
yeah, especially, and
Mm.
I've seen even just a real acceleration in that type of thinking, even in the last 10 years or something like that. And I find it really discouraging, and it kind of saddens me
Mm.
because it shows again just how socially unprepared we are for these concept of space travel and you know a worldwide energy source and things like this. Like people just don't understand how hurting people on one side of the world affects you, whether you think it does or not. That we are all one race and one people. We need to work together. And I see how much money these governments are spending on military and politics, and even the corporations and
Yeah.
commercialism and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And I wonder how much more advanced we would be if we poured all that money into education and social understanding and stuff.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
kids in grade one can't get along or aren't taught how to get along, or people aren't taught how to get along with their next door neighbor, or it's every man for himself and stuff like that. And we wonder why countries are fighting and stuff like that, and we have these divisions and borders. So I guess I'm getting a bit off track here, but the importance of understanding that intelligence and life, it's not just on our planet, it permeates the universe. It
Mm.
is in the tiniest microscopic particle to the largest galactic global supercluster.
Right.
It,
Well, I mean, Grant, that's a fascinating answer you've given there, because not too many scientific minds or researchers in these fields would bring up subjects like you've brought up, but maybe things like spirituality or interconnectedness tie into things like, are Are other beings interdimensional? Are these crafts not exactly physical? And until we understand more than just the cold materialistic science, then maybe we don't. Maybe currently we don't have the minds to even comprehend, or scientists say don't have the minds to comprehend what they're dealing with here. And that ties in. I did come across a lot of declassified documents on UFOs in the 1950s, and particularly through a researcher called Richard Dolan, who was a former historian who got into the UFO, research field by accident, and it fascinated him. And a lot of these documents from the CIA and so on, and the NSA from the 50s, they seem to be they seem to be indicating that the U.S. government didn't know what these phenomena were.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, in terms of the politics, some of these people were in positions of, very high power and order, and likely quite arrogant about their importance and status, and, oh, we could buy your country, or we could, wipe you off the face of the map,
Right.
and to be exposed to something that was just completely outside their realm of experience, uh, and so much bigger and more powerful than them. I think it just absolutely, in a very base sense, frightened them. And this is what kind of initiated this cover up. It's like, well, if I'm terrified of this, the masses would be absolutely terrified of this. And so
Well,
there was this
yeah,
kind of effort.
there may be a point in that type of thinking. I mean, we like to believe that we could handle any truths, but maybe we couldn't. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a very old saying: knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Right.
And I think there is this arrogance in man, and in physics, even especially, that physicists have this, idea that they've got it all figured out. They've got this idea in their mind, and it explains everything. And if it doesn't, they have the intelligence and the brain power to grasp anything that you could throw at them. And the universe is a big place. There is stuff out there that if we tried to comprehend it, it would just completely blow our minds, as the saying goes.
I totally believe that. Yeah, and I think I mean, you said before that you were going off track, but I think this field is one of the most complex and interrelates to so many other things that are potentially non-scientific as well. That it's a vast subject, and we'd need many podcasts to cover it all, Grant.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering, like, just the final question is, I'll mention your site again, ovaltech.ca. I'd really encourage any listeners to go visit that, and you can. I think what I like is that you haven't loaded it with too many articles. It's almost like the best of all your research, like a greatest hits album. But one thing I was wondering going through it is, what would you like to do in the future with your research? And like, for example, we've got a mutual friend, the Japanese scientist Takaaki Musha, who's into a lot of he's an engineer in the defense force in Japan by trade, but then he's gone into space research. And then he was telling me about his plans to build a civilian flying saucer, for want of a better phrase, some sort of craft. Maybe it's based on something like what Tesla was doing, but instead of having it governmental, I thought it was a great idea that we try and get some scientists together and attempt to do it with the right financier, attempt to do it, totally in the open, and it's all above board, and anyone can. I don't know whether you have a camera on the scientists in the laboratory, but you show it all. Nothing's classified or anything. Would something like that ever interest you?
absolutely. I am completely interested in projects like that, and I fully believe that this stuff should be completely open source so that anybody can get involved. When it comes to the civilian thing, you were asking me about where this kind of came from. And, when I first got involved with this stuff, I was in my teens and in high school. And
Okay.
I just thought how many ladies I could pick up if I had my flying
Oh.
saucer.
Were they off? Were they off-world ladies or like?
Yeah, no, I hadn't quite got that far,
Right.
just to have some, come for a spin in my flying car or something like that. I thought that would be pretty silly. But in terms of what you're talking about with a flying saucer, there's actually a little thing on my website.
Right.
Um, what kind of fired the whole space race off was this Sputnik, and it's been a bit back in the news again, and
Yeah.
not recently. Um, and this is an excellent place to start because Sputnik was launched with a rocket. And for a small company or a small organization that is really serious about some of these subjects that I've brought up, for a very limited amount of research and money, it would be absolutely possible to develop this technology to the point where you could launch a satellite into space, and maybe all it does is beep, but it would be up there from a civilian organization, and it would be up there without using rocket technology.
Hmm.
And I think that would be something that would really kind of fire people off and get the ball rolling in terms of this technology.
And investors too. I mean, because that goes back to what I was asking at the beginning, like why the stagnation of 45 years? And you say that there's not the interest from governments, but maybe if the if the planet started to see these things, and possibly even ideas like crowdfunding to a degree, as well as maybe private investors, but maybe there would be such an interest. Maybe humanity is not bored with space travel. It's just that I don't know. Maybe we just need to be showing it in a small scale thing like what you're talking about to start with, even um, something in orbit there that's not owned by a corporation or government. Maybe that would get phenomenal worldwide interest. I don't know. And I love what you said there about open source. I think that's the future for. We've just so much of our history is classified.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Saying that though, I have to draw it back and bring it back to the fact that, like, of all the knowledge that I've gained, the most important solution I've come up with is this realization of how important life and intelligence and spirituality is. And people tend to look at these kind of solutions like, oh, I want to be the first person to have a flying car or the first person to, you know, shoot technology into space without a rocket. But that's really kind of just overlooking the most important aspect of all this. That life and intelligence, we're just one little speck in a grand universe. And, it pervades everything. Like on my website, I call it the biological implications. And it is really the only solution to our current state of affairs. Like the space propulsion and these world power distribution systems,
Mm.
these technologies exist. So it's not that's holding us back. It's our social spiritual understanding that is
Wow.
really holding us back from developing this kind of technology. The technology is real. It exists. There's no doubt in my mind. But
Mm.
the real problem is people's understanding of themselves and where they lie in the world. I have a quote here, kind of as a last thing I'd like to say.
Sure.
Uh, the quote is: "Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we with our modest powers must feel humble." And this is actually Albert Einstein that said this.
Was it really?
So,
I thought you were gonna say Tesla.
yeah,
Okay.
Tesla has one. I can read this to you as well. Let's see if I can find it. Tesla says, "Matter at rest, if such a thing could exist, would be matter dead. And he says, death of matter never has a sentence of deeper philosophical meaning being uttered. And he's speaking of the significance that matter could die, that something that we think in man is inanimate, it
Mhm.
may have life in it, that it could die and live.
Right, right. So so everything is alive, and it's just changing into other. If I burn the table I'm resting on now, it turns into something else. Is it where he was going?
No, it's more this concept of spirituality, that there is a life, an intelligence, even in something inanimate that we think of as a table
Yeah.
or a rock
Mm.
or the planet itself, that there's a life or an intelligence. Like maybe you can't have a conversation with a rock, but it's not to say that there isn't some sort of spirit there, some sort of essence there that's greater than the physical sum of all its parts.
Sure.
It's
And
atoms and
potentially, if other civilizations have reached us, they understand the interconnectedness. So I think that's a fantastic way to end this podcast, Grant. And I think we've covered some awesome subjects here. I've learned a lot myself.
yeah, I'm glad to spread. It is the purpose of my website. I'll admit my website is pretty poorly maintained and getting a little dated. I do my best, time permitting, to update. I am more than happy to discuss anything that I've discussed today on a one-to-one base with people, time permitting.
Right. Well, I'll put the link to your site below when this goes up live, this podcast, and anyone can get in touch with you from there. It's all there.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of my concepts and ideas.
Thank you, Grant, and thanks for explaining it to a layman here.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks, Grant. Bye now.
Bye-bye, James.